This discussion of national culture hopefully is a refresher for you. For those of you that may not have had this, get everybody up to speed on what this is. This is based on Hofstede's cultural dimensions: individualism, power difference, power distance, uncertainty, avoidance, masculinity, and to some extent long-term orientation. He added long-term orientation in later research. And you can see where there's these country clusters, if you will: the Far East, the Near East, Latin America, etc. All of these groups, really vary in where they fall in this continuum, for all of these dimensions. And you can see why, again, if you're sort of digging into this, why there might be some tensions and challenges when you've got different groups coming from different perspectives. If you've got a group that's really different to authority, and then you have another group that challenges everything, that creates conflict, right? And if you've got a group that's very masculine and a group that's very feminine, again, more conflict. We run into many, many problems around this. So this is just a great visualization of what that looks like in terms of some of the challenges that we may face. This slide gets into a little bit more detail on the different dimensions. In terms of power distance, where do we see African countries versus Arab countries and Anglo and Germanic countries, etc., and where does the U.S. fall within that? The U.S. falls at a 40. It's on the low end. We have less concern. We have some respect for differences in power and authority, but for the most part, we're much more egalitarian than the Latin American and Asian countries are. And in terms of the individualistic collectivist, the U.S. is the highest possible in terms of individualism, the highest ranked in countries, and other countries like Latin America and Africa and some Asian countries are much more collectivistic. And again, when you're in a culture that's about looking out for yourself versus a culture that's looking out for your neighbor all the time, you can see the tensions that may arise in terms of the kinds of decisions that we make and the way that we manage our people, on a daily basis. The other dimensions of national culture cover things like uncertainty avoidance, or time orientation, and the masculinity versus femininity of a particular culture. And again, uncertainty avoidance is the comfort that we have with ambiguity, and how much do we feel the need to have rules and policies in place in order to get rid of as much ambiguity as possible. And the U.S. is much more comfortable with ambiguity than some other countries. For example, Latin American countries and some East Asian countries are very uncomfortable with uncertainty, and so they try to have very clear rules in place in order to minimize all that ambiguity and that challenge. And the same thing with masculinity and femininity. U.S. is a little bit more masculine than it is feminine, but feminine cultures like Sweden believe in egalitarianism and equality, and that there aren't men's jobs and women's jobs, there's just jobs and people do them. That's why we see in a lot of the Scandinavian countries, family and medical leave and things like that, is not even questioned. Where here in the U.S. it's always a challenge. There's no sense of that being aggressive and assertive is valued all the time, and that's not always the case. Feminine cultures tend to be much more focused on collectivism and everybody getting along and working sure everything is fair for people. And masculine cultures are much more about being assertive and being competitive and stuff like that. And yes, those fall along stereotypes, if you will, but that's, we can call them whatever you want, whether masculine and feminine is the right term or whether it's just assertive versus non-assertive. I don't know how you would want to call it, but there are some clear differences in the way people conduct themselves in the workplace. Japan is very masculine, the U.S. is sort of mid-range, and yet Chile is very very feminine, as is the Scandinavian countries. And so imagine trying to do business with these groups, trying to manage people, and if you come from a masculine culture, trying to manage people who are much more feminine, you're going to get a lot of kickback for that. Last thing is on the time orientation. We here in the United States tend to have a very short-term orientation where we're more focused on sort of the here and now. Long-term orientation cultures tend to be more on the Asian philosophy, where they really think much more long-term about the implications for things. And then the low-term orientation are Africa, Latin America, and things like that. We really do don't think enough about the future implications of what we do. We're much more sort of in that here and now, and maybe that's part of the instant gratification culture or what have you, I don't know, but we tend to be much more focused on the short term as opposed to the long term. So in terms of some of these demographic differences that we've already made reference to, those internal dimensions, if you will, I think it's important to take a few minutes to discuss some of these issues. Number one, this idea that that we're post-racial, or that ethnicity and color and race don't matter, and we know that's not true. Yes, there are different ethnicities, but we've created this concept that race actually matters, and race is actually, most social scientists will argue that race is a social construct. There is no such genetic thing as race. There's genetic things as ethnicity, but in terms of race, less so. Very little evidence to support that. So, you know, again, we've created this social construct that people are a different race from us, so therefore we are making attributions to this group collectively, and we know that's not true. And those collective attributions are stereotypes, right? They're the assumption that you know, everybody is the same because they all have the same race or the same ethnicity or the same skin color, and we know that's not true. But discrimination is still prevalent, and we can see this even if it's implied through this thing called the implicit association test, and it's Project Implicit out of Harvard University. And with Project Implicit, basically what we're looking at is not the explicit issues of discrimination or racism or sexism that we might consciously be aware of, but it's more the implied, and that implied is a reflection of the messages that we get from society about what is considered good and what is not good. You know, we get messages that women in science is not good and that men in science is good. We get messages that, you know, black is bad and white is good, that Asian is a good minority versus, you know, Latinos that are lazy, quote unquote. And I don't believe in any of those stereotypes, mind you, but you can see these are the messages that society gives us all the time, and you can see it even in our political arena, where we hear politicians talking in broad generalizations about different groups. And so there's these implicit associations that we make, that this is good and this is not good, and we have these built-in biases that we might not even be consciously aware of. So Project Implicit, their goal is to sort of make people aware of these implicit associations that we make around race, sex, and ethnicity, and things like that. And the more that we're aware of where our biases are, the easier it is for us to sort of bring more consciousness to it and make better decisions. So we want to be careful about the tendency to stereotype. It's easy to stereotype because that's what our brain wants to do. It wants to lump everything into a category to make it simple and easy. And so, of course, it's really easy for us to come up with a stereotype of what this group is supposed to be like or that group is supposed to be like. It's a natural tendency. But the hope is that with our own cognitions, we can rise above these stereotypes and these implicit associations and make ourselves aware of these challenges. And when we do that, then we're much more likely to bring consciousness to it and enable us to not engage in those stereotypes. The glass ceiling is a great example of challenges that people of different racial, ethnic, and color-based groups, and women also face. You know, there's a barrier, an invisible barrier. They get to go up so high, and then they're just not accepted into that inner circle to be able to make the leap into the higher levels of management, and it's a problem. The other issues, as we've already sort of talked about, is these affirmative action myths. This idea that, you know, affirmative action is about giving people a leg up that don't deserve it or that haven't worked hard, or, you know, everybody should have the same opportunities, and, you know, why should they be given a special preference? Well, again, the assumption is we all come from the same sort of broad-based background, that everybody, you know, had access to the same equal education and resources growing up. And so affirmative action is about making sure that, you know, nobody gets left behind, you know, that there is opportunity for everybody. And when we attract diverse people, we still have to compete to be the best. And so the goal of affirmative action isn't to hire necessarily people who are, you know, in those protected categories, but it's to make sure that we have a diverse pool to pull from. And that we have to hire then the best person for that job no matter what. There are a lot of assumptions that people make around race or ethnicity. We somehow believe or hope to believe that we are, a post-racial society, that really race and ethnicity and things like this don't matter anymore, but it still does. That DWB that you see on the slide there is called driving while black. And driving while black is a serious phenomenon. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in class when we start talking about privilege and some of the challenges around privilege, but we have to recognize that African Americans, particularly African American males, are more likely to be pulled over for no reason whatsoever. Now, I included the Henry Louis Gates situation here because Henry Louis Gates was harassed by the local police for trying to actually get into his own home. He had left his keys somewhere, and he was trying to break into his home to get back into the house where he lived. And somebody reported him to the police, and the police came and arrested him and harassed him. And of course, he mouthed off back, and became a major argument and an encounter, and unfortunately the man ended up in jail for it. And on the one hand, you can say, well, he shouldn't have mouthed off, but why would the assumption be that he's breaking into his own house? If it were a white man in a suit, no one would have questioned it, but it was a black man in a suit, and therefore they assumed he was breaking into it. And these are the sort of fundamental assumptions that we have to be really careful about around issues of race. Other things that we might see and might be aware of in organizations is this idea of, history months, these history months, and it's Black History Month or Latino History Month or Asian History Month, and these histories are really important for us to understand and embrace, and a lot of our groups, our affinity groups, sort of try to address the issues that these groups might feel collectively, and it's important that we focus on them in that manner. I love the Genderbread Person because it really does try to get at these constructs, if you will, that people tend to lump together as sort of one thing. Let me start with the one in the middle, which says biological sex. People assume that there's only two sexes. There's a male and there's a female. But what people don't realize is that there's an enormous amount of variability in terms of genetic makeup, where there may be all sorts of combinations of genes. You can have XXY, XYY. There's not any one way to be. It's either XX or XY. I mean, I think our science does a big injustice to the prevalence of people who identify as intersexed, who have different chromosomal makeups that present them in very different ways. So we have to be really careful. There may be also situations where someone is genetically male, but because they have a sensitivity to, all sorts of hormones, their body doesn't react to it the way they should. They present as female as opposed to male, or vice versa. They present as male instead of female. And this is not necessarily issues of being transgender. We'll talk about gender identity in a few seconds, but this is about the basic genetics. There is a larger population than anyone would be telling you that are in the column of intersexed, or I wouldn't even say it's a column, it's just a group, that are intersexed. And so anybody that tells you that there's only male and only female, it really is doing a disservice to that group that's in between, that experiences all sorts of different ways of presenting themselves. In terms of sexual orientation, again, I think people sort of get that you can be heterosexual, where you are attracted to the opposite sex. You can be homosexual, where you are attracted to the same sex. But then you have bisexual, which is in that middle ground, where, in fact, they're attracted to anybody. I mean, and I don't mean that in a way that assumes that they're always looking to hook up. I mean, it's a fallacy. But a bisexual is someone who really doesn't care about the form that person is in. It could be male, it could be female. And if you really want to get into it and even more intensely, you could talk about someone who's pansexual. And someone who's pansexual is comfortable with male, female, someone who's genderqueer, someone who may be intersexed and has ambiguous genitalia. It doesn't matter to them. They love the person, the entity, the spirit of that individual, regardless of the body form that it's in. And so orientation, again, is also a continuum, and that nobody is completely heterosexual or completely homosexual either. There's a continuum from one end to the other, as Kinsey taught us. So there's orientation. So biological sex, orientation is the heart, the affinity that we have, and then we have gender identity. And this has really a lot to do with how you feel inside of you, chemically, or the chemistry, the hormones, what have you. When you look in the mirror and someone says you're a woman, and you look in the mirror and you say, I don't feel like a woman, I'm a man, I'm a boy. This is the challenge of gender identity. It's what you feel like inside when you look in the mirror doesn't match. And there's an enormous amount of biological evidence for someone identifying as female in a man's body and identifying as a male in a female's body. That's the transgender continuum, right? Someone who's genderqueer really doesn't identify either way. They just feel very gender fluid. There are moments when they feel more masculine, more like a man, other times they feel more like a woman, or it just sort of doesn't matter. And that's just the way their expression is. But there's tremendous evidence out there where you are in the womb, how much you were flooded with female hormones, how many brothers you have. There's a biological basis for identity, gender identity expression, gender identity, biological sex, and sexual orientation. Tremendous biological evidence to support that this is not a binary, that there is a whole continuum of experiences. Lastly is gender expression, which has nothing to do with your sex that you're born to, your genetics, the people that you love, or your general identity. I mean, I can feel like a female or feel like a male. But gender expression is, do I behave more femininely or more masculinely? We call women who tend to be more masculine, we call them tomboys, right? We call boys who tend to be more feminine sissies. And it doesn't mean that they're necessarily attracted, they're either lesbian or gay. It has nothing to do with who they have an affinity to, but it's how they choose to express themselves, more feminine or more masculine. On one day they can be more feminine, another day more masculine. Our society has very clear boundaries around what is feminine, what is masculine, and we're not supposed to cross that boundary. And that's part of the challenge. We want to put people into a box and assume that they have to behave in a particular way in order for me to feel comfortable, and in fact it doesn't quite work that way. People are entitled to express a whole range of behaviors, whatever is comfortable for them, and we shouldn't have to feel like people have to behave in a particular way or fit into a box in order to be able to do that. So in terms of this issue of sex or gender, again, recognize that we tend to blend these things. When we talk about sex and sex-based discrimination, it is the genetics that we're born to, XX, XY, etc. When we talk about gender, it's typically around the expression of our identity. Whether we identify as a male or female when we're in a body that doesn't quite fit the way that we see ourselves, or whether it's about the gender behaviors that we engage in, the gender norms. What is it, should a woman be, or what is it, should a man be, what's feminine, what is masculine, etc. Men shouldn't wear pink socks, and girls, it's okay for girls to wear jeans. There's all sorts of, double standards out there on how we treat men and women in terms of masculinity and femininity. We know that sexual harassment is being harassed because of your sex, because you're male, because you're female. Quid pro quo means it's the exchange of, sex for sexual favors for job opportunities. A hostile working environment is where it's very sexually charged, where even though I might not be, propositioning you specifically for sex or for some sort of favors, I have an environment that feels very sexual in nature. In terms of gender norms and stereotypes, again, men have a bind because they're not expected to be feminine. They have to be very masculine. If they don't behave in a stereotyped masculine way, they get harassed as being gay or being sissies or being too femme to be a real man, a man's man. And so men get a lot of problems for that. In terms of for women, there's a double bind, right, for women as well. When women behave in the way that people expect a leader to behave, they're supposed to be assertive and directive and stand up for themselves, they're called bitches, and they're called too aggressive, and they are then they're told to be more feminine. And so, yes, there are issues of legal discrimination around this for mixed motives and stuff, but generally speaking, women get a hit as well. When they behave in the way that society expects them to behave, they get told they're not feminine enough. But when they behave in a feminine way, they're not going to get the same opportunities as men when it comes in the workplace. So there's all sorts of norms and stereotypes about what's appropriate and what's not. Pregnancy discrimination, big issue. Even to this day, we still have assumptions about what a pregnant woman can or can't do, and whether or not she should be considered for work. Glass ceiling also affects women, as we discussed with respect to race and gender. And then, we get into this idea of what is transgender or transsexual or intersex, and it makes things much more complex for organizations. And it gets complex around this idea of what do we do about bathroom rights? How do we create a safe place in the bathroom for people to go in and pee if someone feels like there's a man in the woman's room? Well, no, there's a woman in the woman's room. She just happens to, unfortunately, be born in the wrong body. But that's part of the challenge in the education that has to happen around the issues of being transgender. So we'll talk a little bit about that in class. So connecting again with some of the dimensions on that genderbread person is this issue of sexual orientation, and some of the big challenges, of course, we see is marriage rights and versus civil unions and DOMA, and that's pretty much been resolved at this point. The Supreme Court said that we can't deny same-sex couples the right to marry. Religions can, but government cannot. Civil marriages cannot be denied. To same-sex couples. The Defense of Marriage Act was struck down a few years ago, and then in this last year, they finally forced, state governments to recognize that, marriage is appropriate for all people. Civil marriage is appropriate for all people. Civil unions were considered sort of a poor substitute, and Illinois had them for a while, and eventually they came to recognize that civil unions are still less than marriage because the federal government recognized marriage rights, not civil union rights, particularly in terms of Social Security and retirement benefits and things like that. In terms of the impact of sexual orientation in the workplace stuff, well, there's this idea of benefits, and benefits for my partner, benefits for my wife or my husband, and thinking about how do we make sure that we've got benefits that are embracing all family types and in all orientations. A lot of times people say, well, I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to know that you're gay. I don't want to know about your relationship. Well, here's the problem. If you basically tell me you don't want to hear, about the fact that I might have a female partner, and just say, well, okay, it's fine that you're gay. I just don't want to hear about it. Why is it okay for you to put on your desk the picture of your family and your kids and your spouse, who's an opposite-sex spouse, and I can't do that because that's considered in your face? And so you can see where that challenge comes into play for folks is, even though you might say, well, I'll accept you, but I don't want to hear about your life, you're asking me to squelch a big part of who I am. I can't share about my family. I can't share about my kids or my partner because I'm not allowed to say something that might imply that I'm in a same-sex relationship. And so that becomes a problem. So a lot of times people just avoid the topic altogether, and they dive deeper into the closet within their workplace. In their private life, they're completely out and comfortable and what have you, but in the workplace, this creates big problems. It creates barriers between the employees. It creates a barrier between a boss and a subordinate. You're constantly hiding. You're constantly checking to make sure no one knows that you're gay or lesbian, or no one knows that you might be, not the norm. It creates an enormous amount of stress, and it creates barriers for building good relationships and good trusting relationships. It also can limit your mobility. If there are organizations out there that discriminate against people who are gay or lesbian, you don't always have the mobility issues that you want. And we could talk a little bit more about those career mobility issues. And the last challenge we have is around this conflict between orientation and religion, and how do we reconcile workplace rights? Well, people can express any religious beliefs they want to. That's fine. The organization, typically organizations should not, espouse a particular religious belief if they are not a religious organization. It's okay for, Lutheran, family services to say, we're Lutheran. Well, of course you are, because you are a Lutheran group run by Lutherans to support families. That's a religious organization. But a, local mom and pop store, it's not a religious organization. Should they have the right to, discriminate, and say that there's one religion to be and that's it? And that's always a conflict. And then again, when you have the conflict between sexual orientation and religion, I'm not going to work with that person because they're gay and that's against my religion. Well, your job is to do your job. Your job is not here to poke your nose in someone's bedroom and to know what they're doing and who they're sleeping with, right? I mean, the goal here is we need to accomplish a task to get the job done. You don't have to like me to work with me. You don't have to believe in me. I don't agree with everything that, with everybody that I work with. You know, there's a lot of things that I differ on in terms of different kinds of values. But the fundamental issue is, our goal here is not to have a place to have free expression of our values and say, well, because my values are this, I won't work with you. That's not your job. Your job is to do your job, regardless of what your personal values are. And obviously, we don't want to do a job that is in conflict with our values. For example, if the company wants me to work nights and weekends, and that conflicts with my values, that's a totally different different story. I wouldn't take that job, right? But in terms of a standard job, the expectation is, because I'm gay, should I not have the same job opportunities as somebody else? And in fact, people get fired for, just because people don't like them because they're gay, and that's a big issue. In terms of age discrimination, obviously there's this assumption that older workers are slower, more resistant to change, and in some circumstances that may be true, but in other circumstances it may be not. I know plenty of older workers who are still very viable, ambitious, want to learn, want to grow. They're not interested in saying this is the only way to be. They have a lot of KSAs, knowledge, skill, and abilities to offer to a company. The older someone is, the more experience they have, they bring more to the table. And we've already spent some time talking about multi-generational workforces, so I won't reiterate that. But you can see where these generational ideas come from, and then all groups have something unique and interesting to offer. In terms of religion, there's a lot of challenges out there right now about the role of religions in the workplace, particularly, Hobby Lobby. Is it a religious organization such that it can say, I don't want to offer these types of benefits? And obviously the Supreme Court said that was okay. Does that mean that they can't offer birth control at all? No. The Catholic Church, again, should it be, as an employer, can they limit people? And that's not always the appropriate way to think about it. Religious minorities, again, there's assumption that everybody is going to be Christian, and that's not the case. There's a wide variety of religious minorities out there. This last slide is dealing with the issue of privilege, and it's hard to get into it in a lot of detail here in this audio file, but as you can see there, privilege is really when you think something is not a problem because it's not a problem to you personally. And so as a white person, I have privilege that I never had to worry about Jim Crow. It was not my experience at all. So my privilege is I never had to worry about where I could walk in and go eat because I took that for granted. Whereas someone who's African American has to be aware of that. I don't worry about being pulled over randomly when I'm driving my car for somebody to say to me, you look like somebody who was accused of a crime and therefore I need to pull you over because you're driving an expensive car. I've known mixed race students of mine that have driven through upper class neighborhoods and they get pulled over because, are you sure you're supposed to be here? Is this where you belong? This is subtle. This is clear racism. And it's definitely a concern. So the goal here in our discussion on privilege in the classroom is going to be more about realizing that being aware that you have privilege is not really a burden or something you should feel guilty about, but just recognizing that it is an experience that's unique to you that other people don't have, and you have to recognize that your experiences are not everybody else's experiences. And we'll get into talking about that a little bit more.